Imagine a man who fled his homeland twice, renounced his citizenship twice, and spent his final decades as a stateless wanderer before finding refuge in a quiet American university town. Picture someone whose wild hair and rumpled sweaters became the universal symbol of genius, yet who failed his first university entrance exam and couldn't find an academic job for years after graduation. Consider a mind that could grasp the fabric of space-time itself, that could see what no human had seen before, the very structure of reality bending and flowing like water, yet struggled with the everyday chaos of marriage, fatherhood, and human connection. This is Albert Einstein. He was the physicist who toppled Isaac Newton's 300-year reign over physics, who showed that time itself could stretch and compress, that mass and energy were the same thing wearing different faces, that gravity was not a force but a curvature in the geometry of existence itself. He received the Nobel Prize, though not for the work that made him immortal. He became the public face of science in the 20th century. His image reproduced more than any scientist in history. World leaders sought his counsel. Universities competed for his presence. His name became synonymous with intelligence in dozens of languages across the globe. Yet he spent much of his life running from authoritarian schools in Germany that crushed his spirit, running from failed marriages that he could not fix, running from the Nazis who would have murdered him for being Jewish, running, in the end, from the weapon his equations helped create, a weapon that could end human civilization, a burden of guilt he carried until his final breath. The contradictions are almost impossible to reconcile. A pacifist who wrote the letter that launched the Manhattan Project, a man who preached human brotherhood while treating his own family with shocking coldness, a humanitarian who became a Zionist, a gentle, kind presence in the lives of friends and colleagues, capable of warm humour and profound empathy, yet a husband who imposed devastating contracts on his wife, reducing her to a servant, someone who changed everything about how we understand the physical universe, but spent his last 30 years pursuing a unified theory that led nowhere, becoming increasingly isolated from the mainstream of physics, even as his earlier work continued to reshape the field. How does one person contain such extremes? How did a slow, speaking child who seemed backward to his parents, born in a modest apartment in a provincial German city, grow up to quite literally rewrite the laws that govern stars and atoms, light and gravity? And why, having achieved the kind of fame and recognition that scientists dream of, did he spend his final decades increasingly alone, working on problems that his colleagues considered futile, while the world he helped create balanced on the edge of nuclear annihilation? Tonight we will trace the life of Albert Einstein from his difficult beginning in the German city of Ulm to his peaceful death in a Princeton hospital room, with German words on his lips that no one understood. We will follow him through the rigid schools that nearly broke him, through the patent office where he wrote the papers that changed physics, through fame and exile and war, through 2 marriages and 3 children, through the horror of watching his equations lead to Hiroshima, and finally to his last quiet years on Mercer Street, still searching for the unified theory that would explain everything, still playing his violin, still sailing his little boat on the lake, growing ever more remote from the world even as the world celebrated him as the embodiment of human genius. Before we begin this journey through one of the most consequential lives of the modern age, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means more than you know, and it allows me to continue bringing these stories to life. I am always curious to know where in the world you are joining me tonight, so please leave a comment telling me your location and what time it is where you're listening. Now, settle in. Let the concerns of today fade away. Tonight we travel back nearly a century and a half, to a world on the cusp of transformation, to a Germany of empire and industry, of rigid social hierarchies and revolutionary ideas fermenting beneath the surface. We will meet a boy who struggled to speak, who hated authority, who asked questions that seemed strange to everyone around him. We will watch him become a man who could see through the surface of things to the mathematical harmony beneath, who could hold the entire universe in his mind and find it wanting until he had understood it properly. His story reveals not just the birth of modern physics, but the price of genius, the burden of moral responsibility, and what happens when a mind powerful enough to comprehend the cosmos must still inhabit a fragile human body, must still live in a world of politics and war and human cruelty that no equation can explain. But to understand the man who would show that time itself is relative, we must first meet the infant who entered the world with a head so large that his grandmother feared he was deformed, on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 1879 in the ancient city of Ulm. The Germany of 1879 was a nation intoxicated with its own power and potential. 8 years earlier, in 1871, Prussia had unified the German states into a single empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II and his Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. The Franco-Prussian War had been won decisively, France humiliated, German troops parading through the streets of Paris. Now the new German Empire was industrializing at breathtaking speed, transforming from a patchwork of agricultural principalities into a modern industrial power that challenged Britain itself. It was the Second Reich, the second great German empire after the medieval Holy Roman Empire, and it believed itself destined for greatness. Factories rose along the Rhine and Ruhr. Universities flourished, producing scientists and engineers who pushed the boundaries of chemistry, physics, and medicine. German culture celebrated discipline, order, hierarchy, and obedience to authority. Children were taught to respect their elders, students to defer to professors, citizens to serve the state. Into this world of iron and order, of strutting militarism and rigid social structure, Albert Einstein was born on March 14th, 1879, in the city of Ulm, in the Kingdom of Württemberg, in the southern part of the German Empire. Ulm was an ancient city on the Danube River, famous for its towering cathedral with the highest church spire in the world, a monument to medieval ambition rising hundreds of feet into the sky. The city had perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, a mixture of old, medieval quarters with narrow winding streets and newer industrial districts where factories produced textiles and machinery. The Einstein family lived in a modest apartment on Bahnhofstrasse, Railway Station Street, a name that captures the era perfectly, the old world meeting the new, medieval cities now connected by networks of steel rails carrying steam engines and commerce. The building was nothing grand, a simple residential structure in a respectable but not wealthy part of the city, home to shopkeepers and clerks and small businessmen trying to make their way in the booming German economy. Hermann Einstein, Albert's father, was 32 years old when his first child was born. He was a cheerful, optimistic man, kind-hearted but not particularly successful in business. Hermann came from a Jewish family in the Swabian region of southern Germany, people who had lived in the area for generations. His own father had run a small textile business. Hermann had tried various commercial ventures, selling feather beds at first, then moving into the emerging electrical business with his brother Jakob, who had engineering training. Hermann had dreams of prosperity but lacked the ruthless drive and business acumen that would have made those dreams real. He was too trusting, too generous, too willing to extend credit to customers who would never pay. He had warm relationships with everyone, was beloved by friends and family for his good nature and gentle humour, but these same qualities made him a mediocre businessman in the cutthroat world of late 19th century commerce. Pauline Koch Einstein, Albert's mother, came from a somewhat wealthier background. She was 21 years old when Albert was born, beautiful, cultured, educated for a woman of her time and place. Her father, Julius Koch, was a successful grain merchant and banker in the town of Cannstatt. The Koch family had money and standing in their community. Pauline brought a dowry to the marriage and expected a certain standard of living, a certain comfort and security that Hermann would struggle his entire life to provide. Pauline was a woman of strong opinions and firm will. She had been educated in a boarding school where young women learned languages, literature, and music. She played the piano beautifully and loved music with a passion she would pass to her son. She was loving but also controlling, protective of her children but with definite ideas about how they should be raised and what they should become. In the photographs that survive, she stares into the camera with intelligent, penetrating eyes, her mouth set in a line that suggests determination. The marriage between Hermann and Pauline was not unhappy, but it was marked by class tension. Pauline had married slightly beneath her station, and while she loved Hermann, she also worried constantly about money, about their social position, about whether Hermann's cheerful optimism was really just unwillingness to face hard truths about their situation. Hermann tried venture after venture, confident each time that success was just around the corner. Pauline kept the household accounts and worried. Into this household, on March 14th, 1879, at 12:45 on a Friday, Pauline gave birth to their first child. The labour was normal, the delivery without complication, but when the baby emerged, the attending midwife and Pauline's mother, who was present for the birth, were struck by the shape of the infant's head. It was enormous, misshapen, the back of the skull protruding in a way that seemed grotesque. The women whispered their concerns. Pauline herself was frightened. Had something gone wrong? Was the baby deformed? Pauline's mother could not hide her shock. She muttered again and again, according to family stories that Albert would later hear, "Much too fat, much too fat," referring not to the baby's overall size, but to the alarming size and shape of the head. They sent for the doctor, who examined the infant carefully and assured them that such things were not uncommon in newborns, that the skull bones had not yet fused, that the unusual shape would normalise in time. He was right. Within weeks, the baby's head took on a more typical appearance, though it remained noticeably large. They named him Albert after Pauline's father, whose middle name was Albert. It was a solid German name, a name that suggested reliability and substance without pretension. The baby was healthy, despite the initial scare, with a strong cry and good appetite. Hermann registered his son's birth at the local registry office the next day, March 15, 1879, making it official that a boy named Albert Einstein had entered the world. The apartment on Bahnhofstrasse was comfortable but cramped for a growing family. Hermann's electrical business with his brother Jakob was doing moderately well, providing steady income if not wealth. The business manufactured and installed electrical lighting systems, a new technology that was transforming cities across Europe. Electric light was still novel in 1879, the very year that Thomas Edison demonstrated his carbon filament lamp. The Einstein brothers were part of this new industry, hoping to ride the wave of progress to prosperity. But Ulm proved too small for their ambitions. When Albert was just over a year old, 15 months, the family moved to Munich, the capital of Bavaria, a much larger city with far greater opportunities for an electrical business. In Munich, the Einstein brothers established a more substantial operation, Einstein and CGE, manufacturing dynamos and electrical equipment. They secured contracts to install electrical lighting in beer gardens, shops and public buildings. For a time, business thrived. The family settled in Munich's Ludwigsvorstadt-Isarvorstadt district, in a house with a garden, a step up from the apartment in Ulm. Young Albert would spend his childhood and adolescence in Munich, in this house and the electrical factory adjacent to it, surrounded by the hum of dynamos and the smell of oil and copper wire. But Albert was a strange child from the beginning, different from other children in ways that puzzled and sometimes worried his parents. The first and most obvious difference was his speech, or rather, his lack of it. Most children begin speaking simple words around their first birthday, stringing together simple sentences by age 2. Albert was silent. He babbled as an infant, made sounds but formed no words. His first birthday passed with no speech. His second birthday passed. Still nothing. Pauline and Hermann grew concerned, then alarmed. Was something wrong with the boy's mind? Was he deaf, perhaps, though he seemed to respond to sounds? They consulted a doctor who could find no physical cause for the delay, but offered no explanation and no comfort. The boy seemed intelligent in other ways. His eyes followed moving objects. He could manipulate toys with his hands. He understood when they spoke to him, following simple instructions, but he would not speak. When Albert finally did begin to talk, well past his second birthday, he did so in a peculiar way. He would first whisper sentences to himself, moving his lips silently as if rehearsing, and only then would he speak the sentence aloud. He continued this strange habit for years, into early childhood, earning him the nickname Der Deperte among family members, which translates roughly as the dopey one. It was said affectionately, but it reflected genuine puzzlement about what was happening in the child's unusual mind. Modern developmental psychologists have speculated that Einstein may have been on the autism spectrum, noting the delayed speech, the repetitive self-soothing behaviours, the difficulty with social interaction that would mark his entire life. But diagnoses applied retroactively across more than a century are speculative at best. What we know for certain is that Albert was different, that his mind worked in ways that did not match the expectations of those around him, and that this difference both troubled and fascinated everyone who knew him. When Albert was 2.5 years old in November 1881, his sister Maya was born. The family told young Albert that he was getting a new playmate, perhaps leading him to expect something like a toy. When he was brought to see the newborn baby, he stared at the crying, red-faced infant and asked, disappointed, "Where are the wheels?" He had expected a toy that could be rolled around, not this strange creature that wailed and slept. Albert and Maya would become close over the years, though in childhood they had the normal sibling conflicts. Maya later recalled that Albert could fly into sudden rages when frustrated, once throwing a heavy object at her head. Another time he threw a bowling ball at her, yet these outbursts were balanced by deep affection. They played together in the garden. Maya would become his confidant, one of the few people who could reach him emotionally throughout his life. The household was culturally Jewish, but not religiously observant. Hermann and Pauline were secular, modern people who considered themselves German first and Jewish only by ancestry. They did not keep a kosher home. They celebrated Christmas alongside Hanukkah. Hermann was an atheist, or close to it, dismissing religious ritual as superstition. This was common among educated, assimilated German Jews in the late 19th century, people who wanted to be part of modern German culture and saw religious tradition as an obstacle to full integration into German society. However, when Albert reached school age, his parents decided to send him to a Catholic elementary school. This seems paradoxical, but the Catholic school was simply the nearest and best primary school in their Munich neighbourhood. Germany's confessional school system meant most schools had religious affiliations, but for secular families, this was less important than the quality of education. Albert started at the Petersschule in 1885, when he was 6 years old. He hated it from the first day. German schools of the era were authoritarian institutions that emphasized rote memorization, rigid discipline, and unquestioning obedience to teachers. Students sat in rows, recited lessons in unison, were rapped on the knuckles for errors, and learned that questioning a teacher was impudence worthy of punishment. For a boy with Albert's temperament, independent-minded and already inclined to challenge assumptions, it was torture. He was the only Jewish child in his class, and though the teachers treated him fairly enough, the other students did not. They mocked him as a Jew, made cruel jokes, excluded him from their games. Anti-Semitism was casual and common in Germany, not yet the violent hatred it would become under the Nazis, but pervasive enough that Jewish children learned early that they were different, that they did not fully belong no matter how German they felt. Albert withdrew into himself. He had few friends. He played alone at recess, lost in his own thoughts. His teachers found him inattentive, disobedient not through active rebellion, but through passive resistance. A child who simply seemed elsewhere, his mind drifting while lessons droned on. He did his work adequately, but showed no particular brilliance. Nothing in his early school performance suggested he was anything other than an ordinary, perhaps slow, student with mild behaviour problems. But at home, something else was happening, something that would change everything. When Albert was about 5 years old, Hermann showed him a compass. It was a simple pocket compass, the kind sailors and travellers carried. Hermann placed it in Albert's hand, and the boy stared transfixed as the needle swung and settled, always pointing north, no matter how he turned the compass. He was mesmerized. Something invisible was acting on them. Needle, an invisible force reaching through empty space, through the brass case of the compass, through his hand, pulling the needle to always point the same direction. There was nothing touching the needle, yet it moved. The experience shook him profoundly. Years later, he would describe this moment as one of the deep wonders of his childhood, the realization that there were hidden forces in the universe, invisible structures beneath the surface of things. The second great influence came through a young medical student named Max Talmud, who began visiting the Einstein household for dinner every Thursday evening. It was a Jewish tradition for families to invite poor students for a meal, and the Einsteins, though not religious, maintained this custom. Max was in his early 20s, studying medicine at the University of Munich, brilliant and enthusiastic, delighted to find in young Albert a mind hungry for knowledge. Max brought books. He brought a geometry textbook when Albert was 12, expecting it would take the boy months to work through it. Within weeks, Albert had devoured the entire book and solved every problem. He had taught himself geometry, grasped the proofs, understood the relationships between lines and angles and shapes with an ease that astonished Max. Math came naturally to Albert in a way that language never had. Where words were clumsy and imprecise, mathematical relationships were clean, perfect, beautiful. Max brought more books. He brought popular science books explaining the laws of physics, the nature of light, the motion of planets. He brought philosophy, introducing Albert to Kant's critiques. Albert read voraciously, asking questions that showed unusual depth of thought. Max later recalled that soon enough, Albert's mathematical abilities had soared so high that Max could no longer follow his work. The student had become unteachable by his teacher within a few years. Albert began teaching himself higher mathematics, calculus, and advanced algebra using books that Max helped him obtain. By age 14, he had mastered integral and differential calculus, mathematical tools that most students do not encounter until university. He worked through the problems alone, in his room, finding in mathematics a kind of sanctuary, a realm of pure logic where everything made sense, where questions had definite answers that could be proven, where there was no ambiguity or authoritarian decree, only truth. At home, music provided another sanctuary. Pauline insisted that Albert learn to play the violin, beginning lessons when he was 6 years old. At first he hated it, finding the drills and exercises tedious. But then, when he was 13, he discovered Mozart. Something about Mozart's compositions spoke to him directly. The mathematical elegance of the music, the precision and beauty combined. He fell in love with Mozart and through Mozart with the violin. He would play for the rest of his life, turning to his violin in moments of stress or when wrestling with difficult problems. Music and mathematics were linked in his mind, both expressions of underlying harmony. But even as Albert was discovering mathematics and music, his formal education was becoming unbearable. At age 10, he entered the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich, the secondary school that would prepare him for university. The gymnasium was even more rigid than his elementary school, emphasizing classical languages, rote memorization, and military-style discipline. Students were expected to sit motionless for hours, reciting Latin declensions and Greek verb forms, absorbing facts without question or creativity. For Albert, it was suffocating. He loathed the mindless repetition, the emphasis on memorization over understanding, the arrogant teachers who demanded obedience and punished independent thought. He began to rebel in small ways, not through outright defiance, but through a kind of passive non-cooperation that drove his teachers to fury. He asked awkward questions, he pointed out contradictions in lessons. He made clear through his attitude that he considered much of what they were teaching to be worthless. One teacher told him directly that he would never amount to anything. Another suggested that his mere presence in the classroom disrupted the other students. Hermann was called to the school for conferences about Albert's behaviour. The boy was intelligent, the teachers admitted, but insubordinate, unwilling to accept authority, lacking in the discipline necessary for success in German society. Albert was miserable. He hated going to school. He felt trapped in a system designed to break his spirit, to force him into a mould that would crush everything interesting and alive in him. He counted the hours until he could escape to his room, to his mathematics books, to the problems that actually mattered. And then, in 1894, when Albert was 15, his father's business failed. Hermann and Jacob's electrical company had been struggling for years, unable to compete with larger firms. They lost a major contract to install electrical lighting at the Munich Oktoberfest celebration. Debts piled up. Hermann made desperate attempts to save the business, but by 1894 it was clear that bankruptcy was coming. The family made a painful decision. They would leave Munich, move to Milan, Italy, where Jacob had a contact who could help them establish a new business. They would start over in Italy, but Albert would stay behind in Munich to finish at the gymnasium. He was only 15, still had years before graduation, but they could not interrupt his education. He would live with distant relatives and continue his schooling while the rest of the family moved to Italy. Albert was devastated. His family was abandoning him, leaving him alone in a city and a school he hated while they went to Italy. For months after they left, he struggled on alone, attending classes at the gymnasium, living with relatives who found him strange and difficult, sinking deeper into misery. Finally, he could take it no more. He went to the family doctor and convinced him to write a letter saying that Albert was suffering from nervous exhaustion and needed to leave school for his health. Then he went to his mathematics teacher and asked for a letter attesting to his mathematical abilities. Armed with these documents, he presented himself to the gymnasium administrators and announced that he was leaving school. The officials were happy to see him go. They were considering expelling him anyway for his disruptive attitude. Within days, in the winter of 1894, Albert had left Munich and was on a train to Milan, going to join his family in Italy without having finished gymnasium, without a school diploma, his educational future uncertain. He arrived in Milan to find his family settling into a new life. Hermann and Jakob had opened a small electrical factory in Pavia, a city near Milan. The business was struggling as always, but Italy was beautiful, the weather warm, the culture more relaxed than rigid Germany. The Italian people seemed warmer, more tolerant of eccentricity. Albert felt as if he could breathe for the first time in years. He spent several months simply existing, hiking in the Alps, visiting museums and galleries in Milan and Florence, reading books on his own, playing his violin. He was happy for perhaps the first time since early childhood, free from the crushing weight of German authoritarianism. He was in no hurry to return to formal education. But Pauline was worried. Albert was 16 years old, with no school diploma, no prospects, no plan for his future. He needed a profession. She and Hermann decided he should become an electrical engineer like his uncle Jakob, someone who could take over the family business someday and make something of himself. There was a path forward. Switzerland had an excellent technical university, the Eidgenössische Polytechnische Schule in Zurich, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School, later renamed the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH. The Polytechnic had a liberal entrance policy. Students could take an entrance examination, and if they passed, they could be admitted even without a gymnasium diploma. Albert was clearly gifted in mathematics and physics. If he could pass the exam, he could get the education he needed. In the autumn of 1895, 16-year-old Albert Einstein travelled to Zurich to take the Polytechnic entrance examination. He was confident in his mathematical abilities. He was brilliant at mathematics and physics, far ahead of most students his age. Surely he could pass. He failed. He excelled in the mathematics and physics sections of the exam, scoring the highest marks. But he failed the other sections, French, chemistry, biology. His overall score was insufficient for admission. The examiners recognised his unusual talent in mathematics and physics, but the rules were clear. He had not passed. However, the director of the Polytechnic, Albin Herzog, saw something special in the boy. He told Albert that if he would spend a year completing his secondary education at a Swiss school, earning the equivalent of a gymnasium diploma, he would be admitted to the Polytechnic the following year without needing to retake the entrance exam. There was a good school in Aarau, a small town in northern Switzerland, about 40 kilometres west of Zurich. The school was run by Jost Winterler, a progressive educator who believed in nurturing students' natural curiosity rather than crushing them into conformity. The atmosphere at the school was liberal, almost bohemian compared to German schools. Students were encouraged to think independently, to question, to explore ideas. Albert enrolled at the Aarau Cantonal School in the fall of 1895. He boarded with the Winterler family, whose home was warm and welcoming. Jost Winterler was a kind, open-minded teacher who recognised Albert's gifts and gave him the room to develop. The Winterler household was filled with music and conversation and laughter, everything the rigid German schools had lacked. For the first time, Albert thrived in school. The teaching methods at Aarau emphasised understanding for memorisation, encouraged students to ask questions, valued creative thinking. Albert's grades improved dramatically. He studied languages, history, literature, science, but above all he studied physics and mathematics on his own, reading university-level texts, working through advanced problems. He also fell in love, after a fashion, with Marie Winterler, the daughter of his host family. She was 18, he was 16. They walked together, talked together, exchanged affectionate letters. It was a sweet, innocent romance, the first stirring of romantic feeling in a boy who had until then been entirely absorbed in books and mathematics. Marie thought they had an understanding that they might marry someday. But Albert's feelings were not as deep as hers. When he graduated from Aarau in 1896 and has moved to Zurich to attend the Polytechnic, he simply stopped writing to her. He ended the relationship by silence, by absence, with no explanation or ceremony. Marie was devastated. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his life, this emotional distance, this inability to sustain intimate connections, this tendency to withdraw when relationships demanded too much of him. There was one other significant event during his year in Aarau. In January 1896, still 6 months before his 17th birthday, Albert Einstein officially renounced his German citizenship. He had come to hate German militarism, German authoritarianism, everything the Second Reich represented. He would not serve in the German army, would not be subject to German laws and German social expectations. He submitted the necessary papers to the German authorities, paid the required fees, and became stateless. Person without a country. He would remain stateless for the next 5 years until he acquired Swiss citizenship in 1901. To be stateless was to be vulnerable, to lack the protections that citizenship provides, but Einstein preferred it to being German. The decision reveals something essential about his character, his willingness to stand apart, to reject the collective in favour of individual conscience, to accept the costs of independence. In October 1896, at age 17, Albert Einstein entered the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich as a student in the mathematics and physics teaching diploma program. He was one of a small class of students training to become teachers. The Polytechnic was not yet the prestigious ETH it would become, but it offered solid instruction in mathematics and physics from capable professors. Zurich in the 1890s was a liberal cosmopolitan city, a haven for political refugees and free thinkers from across Europe. Socialists, anarchists, Russian, revolutionaries all found refuge in Switzerland's tolerant atmosphere. The Polytechnic reflected this openness, admitting women at a time when most European universities did not, attracting students from many countries. Albert should have thrived. He was finally studying subjects he loved at an institution that valued intellectual inquiry. But he clashed almost immediately with the teaching methods and his professors. The Polytechnic, like all universities of the era, emphasized attending lectures, taking notes, mastering the professor's presentation of the material. Students were expected to defer to professorial authority, to learn what was taught in the way it was taught. Einstein had no patience for this. He skipped lectures frequently, finding them boring and outdated. Instead, he spent his time in his rented room or in cafes, reading the latest physics journals, studying the cutting-edge work being done across Europe, teaching himself the most current theories. He was particularly interested in Maxwell's electromagnetic theory, which was transforming physics but was not yet part of the standard curriculum at Zurich. He could get away with skipping lectures because one of his classmates, Marcel Grossmann, attended every lecture, took meticulous notes, and lent them to Albert before exams. Grossmann was everything Einstein was not: disciplined, organised, respectful of authority. The two became close friends despite their differences. Grossmann's notes allowed Albert to cram before exams and pass his courses, while spending most of his time pursuing his own interests. There was also Mileva Maric, the only woman in their class. Mileva was Serbian, dark-haired, quiet, intense, brilliant at mathematics and physics. She was 3 years older than Albert and had already completed university study in Switzerland before enrolling at the Polytechnic. She had a slight limp from a childhood tubercular infection of the hip bone and a reserved, melancholy temperament that masked fierce intelligence. Albert was drawn to her. Here was someone who understood mathematics, who could discuss physics, who was serious and intellectual and utterly unlike the silly girls he had known. They studied together, worked through problems together, took long walks discussing electromagnetic theory and philosophy. A deep friendship developed that slowly became romantic. But their relationship was complicated from the start. Albert's mother, Pauline, was horrified when she learned that her son was involved with this older, Serbian, Orthodox Christian woman who walked with a limp. Pauline had ambitions for Albert's marriage, hoping he would marry someone from a good German Jewish family, someone who would be a proper wife and help him rise socially. Mileva was everything Pauline did not want: foreign, poor, from the wrong religion, physically imperfect. Pauline fought the relationship viciously. She wrote angry letters. When Albert visited his family, she subjected him to scenes, weeping and shouting that he was ruining his life, that Mileva was unsuitable, that the marriage would be a disaster. The opposition from his family only made Albert more determined, more attached to Mileva, seeing in their relationship an act of independence, a rejection of his mother's control. Albert graduated from the Polytechnic in July 1900, earning his teaching diploma. His grades were good, but not outstanding. His professors found him talented, but difficult, too independent, too dismissive of established methods. When Albert sought recommendations for academic positions, his professors were lukewarm. They had students they liked better, students who had attended their lectures and shown proper respect. As a result, Einstein could not find an academic position. He applied to universities across Switzerland and Germany. Every application was rejected or went unanswered. Graduates of the Polytechnic normally had little trouble finding positions as secondary school teachers or university assistants, but Einstein was different. He had antagonized the very people who could have helped him. For 2 years after graduation, from 1900 to 1902, Einstein drifted. He took temporary tutoring jobs, teaching mathematics and physics to children. He was fired from one position for criticizing the student's mother. He lived in cheap rooms, struggled to pay rent, depended on loans from friends. His father's business failed again in Italy, and Hermann could not send money. It was a low, desperate time. Worse, his relationship with Mileva was causing a crisis. Mileva had failed her final exams at the Polytechnic twice. She did not receive her diploma. Whether the failures were due to inadequate preparation, to the bias of male professors against female students, or to emotional distress over her relationship with Albert, we cannot know. But the failures ended her hope of an academic career. She had sacrificed everything to study physics, defying her family's expectations for a Serbian woman, enduring the hostility of male classmates and professors, and now she had nothing to show for it. In early 1902, Mileva discovered she was pregnant. She was 26 years old, unmarried, living in scandal with a man whose family despised her, in a foreign country, with no money and no prospects. She returned to her family's home in Novi Sad, Serbia, to give birth. In January 1902, she delivered a daughter, whom they called Liesel. What happened to Liesel Einstein remains one of the mysteries of Einstein's life. The child was never brought to Switzerland. Mileva returned without her after a few months. The baby may have been given up for adoption, or she may have died of scarlet fever in infancy. A letter Albert wrote in September 1903 mentions the child having scarlet fever. After that, Liesel vanishes from the historical record. Albert never mentioned her again in his correspondence, never spoke of her to his later children or to friends. She became a secret, a ghost. In June 1902, just as Einstein's situation seemed most hopeless, Marcel Grossmann's father did him an extraordinary kindness. Grossmann's father knew the director of the Swiss Federal Patent Office in Bern and recommended Einstein for a position. The job was as a technical expert third class, examining patent applications for new inventions and determining whether they were novel enough to deserve legal protection. It was not a glamorous position. It was a civil service job, a bureaucratic post that had nothing to do with university physics. But it paid a steady salary, 3,500 Swiss francs a year, enough to live on modestly. Einstein, desperate for any employment, accepted immediately and moved to Bern. He started work at the Patent Office on June 23, 1902. The Patent Office would be his home for the next 7 years, from 1902 to 1909. These would be the most creative years of his life, the years when he produced the work that changed physics forever. But when he started, he was simply a failed academic, aged 23, grateful to have any job at all, working 6 days a week examining other people's inventions, unknown to the scientific world, with a secret daughter abandoned in Serbia and a relationship with Mileva that his family considered a disgrace. In October 1902, Hermann Einstein died in Milan. He was only 55, but the repeated business failures had worn him down, and a heart condition that had troubled him for years finally killed him. On his deathbed, Hermann gave his blessing to Albert's marriage to Mileva. Perhaps Hermann knew he was dying and wanted to give his son peace. Perhaps he simply gave up the fight. Either way, his permission removed the last obstacle. In January 1903, Albert and Mileva were married in a small civil ceremony in Bern. No family members attended. They took a small apartment and began married life. In May 1904, their son Hans Albert was born, a healthy baby, whom Albert adored. The existence of Liesl remained a secret from everyone in their new life in Switzerland. The years from 1902 to 1905 were years of grinding routine punctuated by moments of transcendent insight. Einstein went to the patent office every morning 6 days a week. He sat at a desk examining patent applications, most of them trivial, some clever, a few genuinely innovative. The work was not intellectually challenging, but it trained his mind in useful ways, forcing him to analyze devices quickly, to see the essential idea beneath the technical details, to judge whether something was truly new or merely a variation on existing inventions. More importantly, the patent office gave him stability and time. The work did not fill 8 hours. He finished his assignments quickly and spent the remaining time at his desk working on his own physics, scribbling equations on scratch paper, thinking through problems, using the patent office as a paid refuge where he could pursue his real work. In the evenings and on Sundays, he continued his private research. He met regularly with a small group of friends who called themselves, half-jokingly, the Olympia Academy. They gathered in apartments or cafes, read philosophy and science, argued about ideas, drank coffee and smoked pipes and talked late into the night about the nature of reality. The members of the Academy were Michel Bessot, who worked at the patent office with Einstein and became his lifelong friend Konrad Habicht, a mathematician, and Maurice Solovine, a philosophy student. They read Hume and Mach, Spinoza and Poincaré, debating empiricism and the foundations of knowledge. These discussions sharpened Einstein's thinking, forcing him to articulate his ideas, to defend his intuitions, to clarify his reasoning. Bessot, in particular, became Einstein's sounding board, the friend who would listen patiently while Einstein talked through problems, asked questions that forced Einstein to explain his thinking more clearly. Years later, Einstein would say that talking with Bessot had been essential to his work. At home, his marriage to Mileva was already showing strain. Mileva had hoped to be Einstein's scientific partner, to collaborate on research as they had in their student days. But motherhood and housekeeping consumed her time, and Einstein showed little interest in making her a collaborator. He worked on his physics in private. sharing his ideas with his Olympia Academy friends more than with his wife. Mileva grew resentful, depressed, trapped in domesticity while Einstein pursued the intellectual life she'd wanted for herself. But Einstein was thinking. He was thinking about light, about atoms, about time and space, about the fundamental structure of physical reality. He was reading the latest work by Max Planck on black body radiation, by Hendrik Lorentz on electromagnetic theory, by Ernst Mach on the philosophy of science. He was questioning assumptions that no one else questioned, seeing contradictions that no one else noticed. He asked himself simple questions that turned out to have revolutionary answers. What is time? How do we know that two events happen simultaneously? What does it mean for something to move? What is the relationship between matter and energy? These questions had troubled him since adolescence. Now, finally, he was finding answers. The year 1905 would later be called Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, his miracle year, the year when a 26-year-old patent clerk in Bern published 4 papers that would change physics forever. The first paper appeared in March. The journal was Annalender Physik, the leading German physics journal. The paper was titled On a Heuristic Viewpoint Concerning the Production and Transformation of Light. In it, Einstein proposed something radical, that light was not a continuous wave as everyone believed, but consisted of discrete packets of energy, which he called quanta. The wave theory of light was settled science, confirmed by centuries of experiments. Light behaved like a wave, creating interference patterns, diffracting around obstacles. James Clerk Maxwell's electromagnetic theory, the triumph of 19th century physics, treated light as electromagnetic waves. Everyone accepted this, but Einstein saw a problem. When light interacted with matter, when atoms absorbed or emitted light, the wave theory did not match observations. There was an effect called the photoelectric effect, where light striking a metal surface caused electrons to be emitted. According to wave theory, brighter light, which meant higher intensity waves, should give electrons more energy. But experiments showed that was not what happened. The energy of emitted electrons depended only on the frequency of the light, its colour, not its brightness. Blue light, even dim blue light, produced energetic electrons. Bright red light produced nothing. Einstein proposed that light came in discrete bundles, quanta, each quantum carrying an energy proportional to the frequency of the light. When a light quantum struck an electron, it transferred all its energy to that electron in a single interaction, like a billiard ball collision. Brighter light meant more quanta, so more electrons would be emitted, but the energy of each electron depended only on the energy of the individual quantum that hit it, which depended on the frequency. It was a beautiful solution that explained the photoelectric effect perfectly. It also contradicted everything physicists thought they knew about light. The idea that light could be both a wave, as Maxwell's equations and interference experiments proved, and a particle, as the photoelectric effect suggested, was absurd. Light had to be one or the other. It could not be both. Einstein's contemporaries rejected the light quantum hypothesis almost unanimously. Even Max Planck, who had introduced the quantum concept in a limited way to explain black body radiation, thought Einstein had gone too far. For years, the light quantum was dismissed as a wrong turn, an interesting idea that could not be correct because it violated too much established physics. But Einstein was right. The light quantum, later called the photon, would become a cornerstone of quantum mechanics. And in 1921, 16 years after the paper was published, Einstein would receive the Nobel Prize in physics, specifically for his explanation of the photoelectric effect. The second paper, published in May, was less revolutionary but equally important. It was titled On the Movement of Small Particles Suspended in a Stationary Liquid as Required by the Molecular Kinetic Theory of Heat. The paper explained Brownian motion, the erratic jiggling of a microscopic particle suspended in water, which had been observed since the 1820s but never properly explained. Einstein showed that Brownian motion was caused by collisions between the visible particles and invisible water molecules. The water molecules were in constant random thermal motion, bouncing off each other and off the larger particles. These countless random collisions from different directions caused the visible particles to jiggle unpredictably. More importantly, Einstein's mathematical treatment of Brownian motion made it possible to calculate the size of atoms and molecules and to prove that they really existed. In 1905, despite 2 centuries of atomic theory and chemistry, not all scientists accepted that atoms were real physical objects rather than convenient fictions. Einstein's paper provided a way to measure atoms through their effects on Brownian motion. When experiments confirmed Einstein's predictions, the reality of atoms could no longer be doubted. The third paper appeared in June. It was titled On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, and it introduced what would become known as the special theory of relativity. Of all Einstein's 1905 papers, this was the one that would make him famous, the one that would revolutionize physics, the one that would overturn 3 centuries of Newtonian mechanics. Einstein started with a simple observation. Maxwell's equations describing electromagnetism predicted that light travelled at a constant speed, about 300,000 kilometers per second. But according to Newton's physics, velocities should add. If you run toward a light source, the light should appear to approach you faster than if you stand still. If you run away from a light source, the light should appear to approach you more slowly. This was common sense, confirmed by everyday experience with moving objects. But Maxwell's equations said the speed of light was constant, always the same regardless of the motion of the source or the observer. Experiments, most famously the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887, confirmed this. Light always travelled at the same speed regardless of the Earth's motion through space. This seemed to contradict Newton's laws of motion. Most physicists tried to save both Newton and Maxwell by introducing patches and complications, most notably the idea of a luminiferous ether, an invisible medium filling all space through which light waves propagated. Einstein took a different approach. He accepted that the speed of light was truly constant, and asked what that meant for our understanding of space and time. His answer was startling. Time and space were not absolute as Newton had assumed. They were relative to the observer's state of motion. 2 observers moving relative to each other would measure time differently. They would measure distances differently. What appeared simultaneous to one observer would not be simultaneous to another. There was no universal absolute time ticking away the same for everyone in the universe. There was no absolute space with fixed distances. Time and space were interwoven into a 4-dimensional space-time, and measurements of time and space depended on one's frame of reference. The faster an object moved, the more pronounced these effects became. At everyday speeds, the effects were too tiny to notice, which is why Newton's physics seemed correct for 3 centuries. But as speeds approached the speed of light, time dilation and length contraction became significant. Time slowed down for rapidly moving objects. Distances contracted in the direction of motion. At the speed of light itself, time would stop entirely, and lengths would shrink to 0, which is why nothing with mass could reach the speed of light. The paper was 30 pages of dense mathematical reasoning built on 2 simple postulates. First, that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames, frames moving at constant velocity, and second, that the speed of light in vacuum is constant for all observers. From these 2 principles, Einstein derived a complete revision of mechanics, showing that velocities did not simply add as Newton thought, that mass increased with velocity, that simultaneity was relative, that space and time were unified. The paper barely mentioned Maxwell or previous work on electrodynamics. Einstein presented his theory as if he had invented it whole, though in fact, many of the mathematical transformations he used, the Lorentz transformations, had been derived earlier by Hendrik Lorentz and Henri Poincaré. But what Einstein saw, and what others had missed, was that these transformations represented a fundamental revolution in our understanding of space and time, not just a mathematical trick to make Maxwell's equations work in moving frames. The response was muted. Most physicists did not know what to make of the paper. It was published in a reputable journal, so it was read, but it seemed too strange, too radical. Surely time could not really be relative. Surely there was one absolute time, one true simultaneity, even if we could not measure it. The idea that time itself bent and stretched depending on motion was philosophically disturbing. A few physicists recognized immediately that Einstein had done something extraordinary. Max Planck, the most respected physicist in Germany, read the paper carefully and grasped its significance. He began corresponding with Einstein and discussing the theory with his colleagues. Gradually, a few other physicists began to take the theory seriously, testing its predictions, exploring its implications. Then in September 1905, Einstein published a short follow-up paper, just 3 pages long, titled, "Does the inertia of a body depend upon its energy content?" This paper introduced what would become the most famous equation in physics, E-M-C2, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Einstein showed that his special theory of relativity implied that mass and energy were equivalent, 2 forms of the same thing. Mass was concentrated energy. Energy had mass. If an object emitted energy, say by radiating light, its mass decreased. If an object absorbed energy, its mass increased. The amount of energy equivalent to a given mass was enormous because C2, the speed of a light squared, was such a huge number. This insight would have staggering implications. It explained where the sun and stars got their energy, by converting tiny amounts of mass into enormous amounts of radiant energy through nuclear fusion. It made possible nuclear power and nuclear weapons, where small amounts of matter converted to energy could level cities. But in 1905, these implications were far in the future, and most physicists simply did not believe that mass and energy were truly equivalent. Einstein also submitted his doctoral dissertation to the University of Zurich in 1905. His thesis, titled "A New Determination of Molecular Dimensions," used statistical methods to calculate the size of molecules in solution. It was competent work, not brilliant, but solid enough to earn him a PhD in physics. He had the degree by 1906. 5 papers in 1 year, any one of which would have been a major contribution to physics. 3 of them revolutionary, 4 of them would eventually be cited in Nobel Prize deliberations. And all of this from a patent clerk working in his spare time, with no university position, no access to laboratories or assistants, no contact with the leading physicists of the day except through reading their published papers. It was the greatest outpouring of scientific creativity in modern history, comparable only to Newton's plague years of 1665 to 1666, when Newton, also young and isolated, had invented calculus and discovered the law of gravitation. But unlike Newton, who waited years to publish, Einstein had put his ideas into the world immediately, eager to share them, to have them tested and discussed. Yet even after 1905, Einstein's life did not immediately change. He continued working at the patent office. His salary was raised slightly, to 4,500 francs per year. He was promoted to technical expert second class, but academically he was still unknown. The papers in Annalen der Physik were noticed by a few specialists, but the scientific community was slow to react. It took years for the significance of his work to be recognised. Gradually, though, more physicists read the papers and began to understand that something important had happened. Younger physicists especially were excited by the new ideas. Older physicists were more resistant, unable to abandon the comfortable certainties of Newton and Maxwell. Einstein continued his research in the evenings and on Sundays, publishing more papers, extending his theories, applying relativity to new problems. In 1907, he began thinking about gravity, wondering whether his special theory of relativity, which applied only to constant velocity motion, could be extended to cover acceleration and gravity. This would occupy him for the next 8 years. In 1908, Einstein finally received his first academic recognition. Hermann Minkowski, one of his former professors at the Zurich Polytechnic who had not thought much of Einstein as a student, reformulated Einstein's special relativity theory in elegant four-dimensional mathematical language, showing that space and time formed a unified four-dimensional continuum, space-time. Minkowski's formulation made the theory clearer and more accessible to mathematically sophisticated physicists. In 1908, Einstein also began lecturing. He was appointed a privet dozent at the University of Bern, an unpaid position that gave him the right to offer lectures and collect fees from attending students. His lectures were brilliant but sparsely attended. He had no reputation yet, and students preferred courses from established professors. At one point, only 3 students signed up for his course, and he eventually gave up and resigned the position. But change was coming. In 1909, Einstein received his first real academic appointment as an associate professor at the University of Zurich. It was not a prestigious position, and the salary was little better than what he had earned at the patent office. But it was an acknowledgement that his work had value, that he belonged in academia. He left the patent office in July 1909, after 7 years of service. He would later say that his time there had been valuable, that the work had trained his thinking in useful ways, that the stability and freedom from academic politics had allowed him to develop his ideas without pressure. But he was glad to leave, ready to devote himself fully to physics. At Zurich, Einstein thrived for a time. He taught courses in mechanics and thermodynamics, developed a reputation as an inspiring if disorganized lecturer, continued his research. But the position was not quite right. The teaching load was heavy, the pay modest, the resources limited. Then in 1911, Einstein received an offer from the German University in Prague, one of the 2 universities in the city of Prague in what was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The position was a full professorship with a good salary, better facilities, lighter teaching duties. Einstein accepted and moved with Mileva and their 2 sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, who had been born in 1910, to Prague. Prague was a beautiful city but a troubled one, full of ethnic and linguistic tensions between Czechs and Germans, Jews and Christians. Einstein found the rigid social hierarchies oppressive, reminiscent of the German society he had left as a teenager. Mileva was miserable, isolated, struggling with depression, feeling that Einstein neglected her and the children for his work. But scientifically, Einstein's time in Prague was productive. He published several important papers on the quantum theory of radiation and on the bending of a light by gravity. He predicted that light from distant stars would be bent as it passed near the sun, and that this bending could be measured during a solar eclipse. This prediction would later make him world famous. By 1912, Einstein was eager to leave Prague. When his old school, the ETH in Zurich, offered him a full professorship, he accepted immediately. He returned to Zurich, to the city where he had studied, where he had the happiest memories, where his closest friend Marcel Grossmann still worked as a professor of mathematics. At the ETH, Einstein had access to the mathematician he needed. He was working on extending his special theory of relativity to cover gravity and acceleration, what would become general relativity. The mathematics was ferociously difficult, involving tensors and differential geometry, tools that Einstein had never fully mastered. Grossmann helped him, just as Grossmann had lent Einstein his lecture notes years before at the Polytechnic. Now he taught Einstein the mathematics of curved spaces, Riemannian geometry, tensor calculus. Together, they worked through the problem, trying to find the right mathematical language to express Einstein's physical intuition that gravity was not a force, but a curvature of space-time itself. But even as Einstein was making progress on what would be his greatest work, his personal life was collapsing. His marriage to Mileva had deteriorated beyond repair. They fought constantly. Mileva resented Einstein's total absorption in his work, his emotional distance, his neglect of family responsibilities. Einstein found Mileva's depression and bitterness unbearable, felt trapped in a loveless marriage, blamed her for his unhappiness. Moreover, Einstein had reconnected with his cousin Elsa Lowenthal, a widow living in Berlin with her 2 daughters. Elsa was warm, practical, unintellectual, someone who would take care of Einstein without demanding emotional reciprocity. They began an affair, exchanging affectionate letters, making plans for a future together. In 1913, Max Planck and Walter Nernst, 2 of the most eminent physicists in Germany, travelled to Zurich to make Einstein an extraordinary offer. The Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin wanted to appoint Einstein as a member. He would also be made director of a new Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics, a research institute being created to support theoretical physics. And he would receive a nominal professorship at the University of Berlin with no teaching duties but with a full professor's salary. It was an offer no physicist could refuse. Berlin was the centre of German science, home to the best physicists, the best facilities, the most prestigious institutions. The position would give Einstein complete freedom to pursue his research with no obligations except membership in the academy. He would be financially secure and surrounded by the leading minds in physics. There was one complication. Elsa lived in Berlin. If Einstein moved to Berlin, he would be in the same city as his mistress, which would make his affair easier to continue, but would make his marriage even more untenable. Einstein accepted the position. He moved to Berlin in April 1914, bringing Mileva and their 2 sons with him. But the marriage lasted only 3 months in Berlin. Mileva could not tolerate Einstein's relationship with Elsa. Einstein could not tolerate Mileva's scenes and accusations. In July 1914, Mileva took Hans Albert and Edward and returned to Zurich, leaving Einstein alone in Berlin. Before she left, Einstein presented her with a document, a list of conditions under which he was willing to continue the marriage. She would cook his meals, keep his rooms clean, do his laundry, and bring him 3 meals a day in his study. She would expect no affection or intimacy. She would stop speaking to him immediately when he requested it. She would leave his bedroom and study immediately when he requested it. She would not expect any relationship beyond the strictly practical. Mileva signed the document, desperate to save the marriage for their son's sake, but the attempt was futile. Within weeks she had taken the children and left. Einstein sent her money for their support, but made no effort to repair the relationship. He was free of the marriage emotionally, if not legally, living alone in Berlin, seeing Elsa regularly, absorbed in the greatest work of his life. In August 1914, 1 month after Mileva left, World War I began. Germany invaded Belgium and France. Russia mobilized. Britain entered the war. Within weeks, the old European order that had seemed so stable collapsed into a catastrophe of industrial slaughter that would kill millions and destroy empires. Einstein was horrified by the war. He had always been a pacifist, opposed to militarism and nationalism. Now he watched Germany descend into war fever. Professors and intellectuals he had respected signing manifestos supporting Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium, cheering the troops marching off to war. In October 1914, 93 German intellectuals, including many of Einstein's colleagues, signed the Manifesto to the Civilized World, defending German militarism and denying German atrocities in Belgium. Einstein was invited to sign. He refused. Instead, he signed a counter-manifesto, a call for peace and international cooperation, signed by only 4 people. It was an act of courage in wartime Berlin, where dissent could mean imprisonment. But even as the war raged, Einstein worked on his theory of general relativity. The work was exhausting, the mathematics brutally difficult. He struggled for years to find the right equations, making false starts, discovering errors, starting over. He was driven by the conviction that gravity must be understood geometrically, that massive objects curve space-time, and that this curvature is what we experience as gravity. By late 1915, he was close. In November 1915, Einstein presented a series of lectures at the Prussian Academy, working through the mathematics, refining his equations week by week. On November 25, 1915, he presented the final field equations of general relativity, the mathematical description of how matter and energy curve space-time, and how that curvature determines the motion of objects. The equations were beautiful and terrifying in their complexity. They replaced Newton's simple inverse square law of gravitation with a set of 10 coupled nonlinear partial differential equations relating the curvature of space-time to the distribution of matter and energy. Solving these equations for any realistic situation was extraordinarily difficult, often impossible, requiring approximations and simplifications. But the theory made predictions that could be tested. Newton's theory predicted that the planet Mercury should orbit the Sun in an ellipse that held its orientation in space. But observations showed that Mercury's orbit precessed, that the ellipse rotated slowly over time. The precession had been observed for decades and could not be explained by the gravitational influence of other planets. It was a small effect, but a real discrepancy between observation and Newton's theory. Einstein's general relativity predicted exactly the amount of precession that was observed, with no adjustable parameters, no fudge factors. When Einstein did the calculation and saw that his theory matched the observed precession of Mercury's orbit to within the measurement uncertainty, he later said his heart pounded, and that he had the feeling that something had snapped inside him. He knew he had found the truth. The theory also predicted that light from distant stars would be bent as it passed near the Sun, the photons following curved paths through the warped space-time created by the Sun's mass. The bending would be twice as large as a crude Newtonian calculation would suggest. Einstein had predicted light bending in 1911 using an incomplete version of his theory, but the full general relativity gave a different, larger value. This prediction could be tested during a total solar eclipse when stars near the Sun's position in the sky became visible. If photographs were taken during the eclipse and compared with photographs of the same star field taken when the Sun was elsewhere in the sky, the stars' apparent positions would be shifted by the gravitational bending of their light. Measuring this shift would test Einstein's theory. World War I prevented such observations. Astronomers could not mount expeditions during wartime, but Einstein published his theory in 1916 in a series of papers and a comprehensive article in the journal Annalen der Physik. General relativity was now public, waiting for the war to end so it could be tested. The war ground on through 1916 and 1917 and into 1918. a senseless slaughter in the trenches of France and Belgium, poison gas and machine guns killing millions for a few miles of muddy ground. Einstein's health suffered during these years. He developed stomach problems, likely an ulcer, and lost significant weight. He was exhausted, depressed by the war, lonely despite his relationship with Elsa. The German blockade caused food shortages in Berlin. Einstein lived on meagre rations, his diet inadequate for someone doing intense intellectual work. Elsa took care of him, bringing him food, nursing him when he was ill, providing the domestic comfort he needed. They grew closer, and it became clear they would marry once Einstein's divorce from Mileva was finalized. Mileva resisted the divorce. She hoped for reconciliation, or perhaps simply wanted to make Einstein suffer. But Einstein was determined. He offered Mileva a bargain. She would agree to a divorce, and in return, if he ever won the Nobel Prize, he would give her the prize money. This was an extraordinary offer. The Nobel Prize money was a large sum, and Einstein seems to have been confident he would win it eventually. Mileva agreed. The divorce was finalized in February 1919. Einstein and Elsa married in June 1919. Einstein gained not just a wife but a household. Since Elsa's 2 daughters from her previous marriage lived with her, suddenly Einstein was a stepfather, living in a bourgeois Berlin apartment with Elsa managing everything, keeping the household running, shielding him from practical concerns, allowing him to focus entirely on his work. That same year, 1919, British astronomers finally tested Einstein's prediction about light bending during a solar eclipse. In May 1919, a total solar eclipse passed over the Atlantic Ocean and Western Africa. 2 British expeditions, one to Sobral in Brazil and one to Principe Island off the coast of West Africa, photographed stars near the sun during totality. The observations were difficult, the measurements uncertain, the weather at Principe poor. But when Arthur Eddington, the leader of the Principe expedition, analysed the photographic plates, he found that the stars' positions were shifted by an amount consistent with Einstein's prediction, not with Newton's, not with a naive bending calculation, but specifically with the amount predicted by general relativity. In November 1919, the results were announced at a joint meeting of the Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society in London. The announcement was dramatic. A British expedition, led by a Quaker pacifist, Eddington, had confirmed the theory of a German scientist during the aftermath of a war between Britain and Germany. Science had transcended nationalism. Truth had prevailed over politics. Overnight, Einstein became world famous. The eclipse observations were front-page news across the globe. Newspapers struggled to explain relativity to general readers, producing oversimplified and often misleading accounts. But the essential message was clear. A German Jew had overthrown Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist Britain had ever produced, and shown that space and time themselves were malleable, subject to bending and warping. The public was fascinated by the idea that time could slow down, that space could curve, that reality itself was stranger than anyone had imagined. Einstein became the embodiment of the mysterious, incomprehensible genius, the wild-haired professor whose thoughts were too deep for ordinary mortals to grasp. Photographs of him appeared everywhere. His face became internationally recognizable. Requests for interviews and lectures poured in. Einstein had not sought fame. He had pursued physics for its own sake, driven by curiosity and the desire to understand nature. Now he was a celebrity, mobbed by reporters, asked for opinions on everything from politics to philosophy, invited to give lectures to packed audiences who came to see the famous genius in person, even if they could not follow his mathematics. He handled the fame with humour and grace. self-deprecating about his own contributions, generous in crediting others, willing to engage with the public. He became a spokesman for science, for rationality, for peace, using his fame to advocate for causes he believed in. But fame also brought hostility. Anti-Semitism was rising in Germany after the war. Germany had been defeated, forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, blamed for the entire war, required to pay crippling reparations. The German economy collapsed into hyperinflation. Many Germans looked for scapegoats, and Jews were an easy target. A movement arose to attack Jewish physics, including Einstein's relativity theory. A group calling itself the Study Group of German Natural Philosophers organised rallies attacking Einstein personally, claiming his theories were incomprehensible Jewish nonsense designed to corrupt German science. Philipp Lenard, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had become a Nazi sympathiser, led the attacks, calling relativity a Jewish fraud. Einstein was threatened. He received death threats in the mail. When he gave lectures, there were sometimes organised disruptions. In 1922, the foreign minister of Germany, Walter Rathenau, who was Jewish, was assassinated by right-wing extremists. Einstein, also Jewish and also prominent, feared he might be next. For a time, he reduced his public appearances and avoided announcing his travel plans in advance. Despite the hostility, Einstein continued his work. Through the 1920s, he pursued what he called a unified field theory, an attempt to combine gravity and electromagnetism into a single theoretical framework, just as Maxwell had unified electricity and magnetism in the 19th century. Einstein believed that general relativity was not the final theory, that it needed to be merged with electromagnetism into a more comprehensive theory. He also engaged with the developing quantum mechanics, though with increasing discomfort. In the mid-1920s, a younger generation of physicists, including Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Max Born and Niels Bohr, developed the full mathematical framework of quantum mechanics, a theory that described the behaviour of atoms and subatomic particles. Quantum mechanics was extraordinarily successful. It explained atomic structure, chemical bonding, the behaviour of matter at the smallest scales. But it was also deeply strange. It said that particles did not have definite positions or velocities until they were measured, that reality at the quantum level was fundamentally probabilistic, that an electron could be in a superposition of multiple states simultaneously until observation collapsed the superposition into a single outcome. Einstein hated this. He believed reality should be objective, definite, independent of observation. He famously declared that God does not play dice with the universe, rejecting the idea that nature was fundamentally random. He engaged in long debates with Niels Bohr about the interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposing thought experiments designed to show that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that there must be hidden variables determining outcomes that quantum mechanics described only statistically. Bohr defended quantum mechanics, arguing that Einstein was clinging to outdated classical intuitions, that reality really was as strange as quantum mechanics said. The Einstein-Bohr debates became legendary in physics, two giants arguing about the deepest questions of how reality works. Most physicists sided with Bohr, accepting quantum mechanics as the correct description of nature even if its implications seemed bizarre. Einstein was increasingly isolated from the mainstream of physics. While younger physicists embraced quantum mechanics and used it to make stunning progress, Einstein pursued his unified field theory, publishing paper after paper proposing different mathematical approaches, none of which led anywhere. His colleagues worried that he was wasting his later years on a futile quest, but Einstein was convinced that quantum mechanics in its current form was incomplete and that a deeper theory was waiting to be discovered. In 1921, Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, not for relativity, which the Nobel Committee still considered too speculative, but for his 1905 work on the photoelectric effect, the explanation of a light quanta. The award vindicated his long-ago promise to Mileva. True to his word, he gave the prize money to her. She used it to buy apartment buildings in Zurich, providing rental income that supported her and their sons for the rest of her life. Through the 1920s, Einstein travelled extensively, lecturing in America, Japan, France, England, giving speeches to huge audiences, meeting with world leaders, using his fame to promote causes he cared about. He became an advocate for Zionism, not initially because he wanted a Jewish state, but because he saw in the Zionist movement a way to preserve Jewish culture and provide refuge for persecuted Jews. He helped raise funds for the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and travelled to Palestine to support its establishment. But even as he travelled and lectured, he always returned to Berlin, to his work, to his apartment with Elsa, to his study filled with papers and books where he pursued his unified field theory. He maintained correspondence with physicists around the world, keeping up with developments even as he pursued his own path. He was productive and engaged, still at the centre of the physics community, even as his interests diverged from the mainstream. Then, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The Nazis took power, and everything changed. Within weeks, the Nazis began purging Jews from universities and government positions. Books by Jewish authors were burned. Jewish businesses were boycotted. The study group that had attacked Einstein's physics in the 1920s now had government support for their anti-Semitic campaign. Einstein was travelling when Hitler took power. He had gone to the United States in December 1932 to lecture at the California Institute of Technology. When news reached him of the Nazi takeover, he announced that he would not return to Germany. He resigned from the Prussian Academy, renounced his German citizenship for the second time in his life, and accepted a position at the newly established Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Elsa followed him, leaving Berlin with whatever belongings they could pack, abandoning their apartment and most of their possessions. Einstein's sisters and extended family scrambled to leave Germany. Many succeeded, some did not, and would later perish in the Holocaust. Einstein arrived in Princeton in October 1933 as a refugee. He was 54 years old, world famous, financially secure thanks to his position at the Institute, but also homeless, exiled from Europe, watching from across the Atlantic as the country of his birth descended into barbarism. Princeton in the 1930s was a quiet university town in New Jersey, sleepy and provincial compared to Berlin. The Institute for Advanced Study was not yet established on its own campus, but was temporarily housed in buildings at Princeton University. The Institute was a kind of paradise for scholars, a place where mathematicians and physicists could pursue research without teaching duties, supported by generous salaries and excellent facilities, free to work on whatever interested them. Einstein settled into a house at 112 Mercer Street, a modest white frame house that would be his home for the rest of his life. Elsa set up the household, tried to shield Einstein from constant requests for interviews and appearances, manage visitors and correspondence. Einstein walked to his office at the Institute each morning, worked on his equations, returned home for lunch, worked in the afternoon, played his violin in the evenings. He made friends in Princeton, especially with Kurt Gödel, the Austrian mathematician who had proven that any sufficiently complex mathematical system contained true statements that could not be proven within the system. Einstein and Gödel walked together regularly discussing mathematics and philosophy, two exiles trying to understand the abstract structures underlying reality while the world around them prepared for war. Elsa died in December 1936 after a long illness. Einstein was grief-stricken. Despite the problems in his first marriage, his marriage to Elsa had been successful, perhaps because Elsa had asked little emotionally, while providing the stability Einstein needed. Her death left him alone in the house on Mercer Street. His sister Maya eventually moved in with him, keeping house, providing companionship. He hired a secretary, Helen Dukas, who managed his correspondence and became a devoted companion, fiercely protective of his privacy. The household settled into a quiet routine, Einstein working, Maya managing the domestic side, Dukas handling the outside world. Through the late 1930s, Einstein watched with horror as Europe slid toward another war. Hitler's Germany annexed Austria, seized Czechoslovakia, signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin's Soviet Union. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. Einstein had been a pacifist his entire adult life. He had opposed World War I, advocated for international cooperation and disarmament, argued that military force was never justified. But the Nazis changed his thinking. Nazism could not be reasoned with. It could only be defeated. He supported the Allied war effort, though it tore at him to abandon his pacifism. In 1939, physicists discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms that released enormous energy. Experiments showed that a chain reaction might be possible, where each fission triggered more fissions, releasing exponentially increasing energy. It became clear that an atomic bomb was theoretically possible, a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. Several refugee physicists, including Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, grew concerned that Nazi Germany might develop such a weapon. They convinced Einstein to sign a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt warning of the possibility and urging the United States to begin its own atomic research. Einstein agreed. In August 1939, he signed the letter that Szilard had drafted, lending his name and prestige to the warning. The Einstein-Szilard letter is often credited with launching the Manhattan Project, the vast American effort to build an atomic bomb. In reality, the letter was one of several factors that influenced Roosevelt's decision, but Einstein's signature carried weight. The great physicist had warned of the danger, and that warning was taken seriously. Einstein played no role in the Manhattan Project itself. He was never invited to participate, never offered a position in the project. This was partly because his pacifism made security officials nervous, but also because Einstein was a theoretical physicist. While the bomb project needed experimentalists and engineers, Einstein spent the war years in Princeton working on his unified field theory, contributing occasionally to war-related research on less sensitive topics, living quietly while across the ocean millions died. In April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. Einstein was saddened by the loss of a president he had respected. A few days later, on April 12th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific continued. Japan fought on even as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands. In July 1945, the Manhattan Project successfully tested the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. The bomb worked. The energy Einstein's equation E=mc had predicted was real. A few pounds of uranium converted to energy could destroy a city. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The city was obliterated. 70,000 people died instantly, with tens of thousands more dying later from radiation sickness and injuries. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. World War II was over. Einstein was horrified. He had known intellectually that his equation implied enormous energy and matter, but seeing it realized as a weapon of mass destruction was devastating. When he learned of Hiroshima, he reportedly said only, "Oh my God." He immediately regretted his letter to Roosevelt, even though that letter had warned of German bombs, not advocated for American ones. The weapon his physics had made possible had killed hundreds of thousands and would hang over humanity forever. For the rest of his life, Einstein became an advocate for nuclear disarmament and world government. He argued that the existence of nuclear weapons meant that national sovereignty was obsolete, that humanity needed a world authority to prevent nuclear war. He joined with other scientists, including Robert Oppenheimer, the leader of the Manhattan Project, in calling for international control of atomic energy and the abolition of nuclear weapons. But these calls went unheeded. The Cold War began. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies during the war, became adversaries. Both developed larger and more powerful nuclear weapons. The arms race accelerated. Einstein watched with despair as the world he had helped create teetered on the edge of annihilation. Through the late 1940s and early 1950s, Einstein continued his work on unified field theory, publishing variations and refinements, but never achieving the breakthrough he sought. His colleagues regarded his efforts as quixotic. Quantum mechanics and quantum field theory were the future of physics. Unifying gravity and electromagnetism classically, as Einstein attempted, seemed futile when quantum effects dominated at the scales where such unification would matter. Einstein knew he was isolated. He joked that he had become a relic, a monument to a past era of physics, but he could not abandon the quest. He believed deeply that reality must be objective and deterministic, that quantum mechanics' probabilistic nature was a sign of incompleteness, that a deeper theory was waiting to be found. He remained active in other ways. He spoke out against McCarthyism, the anti-communist hysteria that gripped America in the early 1950s. He defended scientists and intellectuals accused of communist sympathies, even though his own reputation made him a target. He continued to support Zionism and the new state of Israel, though he was critical of Israeli policies toward Palestinians. In 1952, when Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, died, Israel offered Einstein the presidency. He declined, saying he lacked the natural aptitude for dealing with people and was unsuited to such a position. Life in Princeton settled into a gentle rhythm. Einstein walked to his office at the institute most mornings, worked on his equations, returned home for lunch. He still played his violin, though arthritis made, playing more difficult. He sailed his small boat on the nearby lake, enjoying the peacefulness of water and wind. He received visitors, gave occasional interviews, corresponded with scientists and friends around the world. But age was catching up with him. In 1948, doctors discovered an abdominal aortic aneurysm, a dangerous bulging of the main artery carrying blood from his heart. Surgeons performed an operation to reinforce the weakened artery wall, wrapping it in cellophane to prevent rupture. The surgery was successful, but Einstein knew the aneurysm could rupture at any time, and if it did, he would die quickly. He accepted this calmly. Death did not frighten him. He had lived a full life, made his contributions, seen his children and grandchildren. His son, Hans Albert, had become a professor of engineering in California. His son, Eduard, tragically, had developed schizophrenia in his 20s and lived in a psychiatric institution in Zurich. Einstein sent money for Eduard's care, but rarely visited, unable to cope with his son's illness. In his final years, Einstein's appearance became iconic. His wild white hair, never combed, stood out in all directions. He wore rumpled sweaters and baggy pants. He refused to wear socks, considering them unnecessary. He looked like the stereotype of the absent-minded professor, and the public loved it. Photographs from these years show a gentle, almost grandfatherly figure, eyes twinkling with humour, radiating warmth and wisdom. But beneath the benign exterior was a mind still working, still thinking, still seeking the unified theory. He worked on his equations almost until the end, trying different mathematical approaches, hoping for the insight that would tie everything together. In April 1955, the aneurysm that had been repaired in 1948 began to leak. Einstein felt pain in his abdomen, knew what it meant. He was admitted to Princeton Hospital on April 15th. Doctors examined him and recommended emergency surgery to repair the aneurysm. Einstein refused. He was 76 years old. He had done what he came to do. He did not want his life prolonged artificially. "I want to go when I want," he told the doctors. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." He asked for his current pages of calculations to be brought to the hospital. Even in his hospital bed, weak and in pain, he worked on his equations, trying to solve the unified field theory. He wrote a few more lines, made some corrections. The work remained unfinished. His family came to visit, his stepdaughter Margot, his secretary Helen Dukas. He was calm, accepting, making small jokes, apologizing for the inconvenience of dying. He asked for his glasses so he could read. He slept fitfully. Early in the morning of April 18th, 1955, at about 1 o'clock, Albert Einstein woke. A nurse, Alberta Rossel, was at his bedside. Einstein muttered a few sentences in German, his native language, the language he had spoken as a child in Munich. The nurse did not speak German. She did not understand what he said. Whatever Einstein's final words were, whatever thought or observation or joke passed through his mind in those last moments, was lost forever. A moment later the aneurysm ruptured. Blood flooded into Einstein's abdomen. His blood pressure dropped. His breathing stopped. At 1:15 a.m. on April 18, 1955, Albert Einstein died. The nurse called the doctors. They confirmed death, noting the cause as rupture of the abdominal aortic aneurysm. The body was taken to the hospital morgue. According to Einstein's wishes, there would be no funeral, no grave, no monument. He wanted to be cremated and his ashes scattered to disappear completely, to avoid becoming an object of veneration. But something happened that Einstein had not wanted. The pathologist who performed the autopsy, Dr. Thomas Harvey, removed Einstein's brain without permission from the family, Harvey, preserved the brain in formaldehyde, photographed it, sectioned it into pieces, distributed samples to researchers. He claimed he wanted to study the brain to understand the source of Einstein's genius. The theft of Einstein's brain became a minor scandal when it was discovered. Hans Albert Einstein was furious, but by then the brain had been preserved and cut up. Over the following decades, researchers examined the brain, published papers claiming to find unusual features that might explain Einstein's abilities. None of the findings were conclusive. The brain was, in the end, just a brain, its owner's genius not reducible to neuroanatomy. On the afternoon of April 18th, a small private funeral service was held at the Ewing Crematorium in Trenton, New Jersey. Only family and close friends attended. Otto Nathan, Einstein's friend and executor of his estate, read passages from Goethe. There were no speeches eulogizing Einstein, no religious ceremony. The service lasted only minutes. Einstein's body was cremated. His ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location, as he had wished. There is no grave, no marker, no place where pilgrims can visit. He returned to the elements, becoming part of the world he had spent his life trying to understand. News of Einstein's death made front pages around the world. Newspapers published long tributes, recounting his life, his work, his impact on science and civilization. President Eisenhower issued a statement praising Einstein's contributions to human knowledge and his dedication to peace. Scientists from every country expressed sorrow at the loss. But the death also marked the end of an era in physics. Einstein had been the last link to the heroic age of early 20th century physics, the age of Planck and Bohr and Schrödinger, the age when a single person could revolutionize understanding of nature through pure thought. Physics was becoming more collaborative, more experimental, more dependent on enormous machines and large teams. The age of the solitary genius working with paper and pencil was ending. The legacy of Albert Einstein extends so deeply into the structure of modern life that we barely notice it anymore. We live in a world that Einstein made comprehensible, even as the man himself has faded into icon and myth, his wild hair and tongue-out photograph more familiar than the actual substance of his thought. The immediate impact of Einstein's work was to complete the revolution in physics that had begun with Planck's quantum hypothesis in 1900. Newton's physics, which had governed scientific understanding for 2 centuries, was overthrown twice, by special relativity for fast-moving objects and by quantum mechanics for very small objects. General relativity extended this revolution to gravity, replacing Newton's instantaneous action at a distance force with a geometric curvature of space-time. Special relativity and general relativity together created the framework for modern physics. Every experiment, every observation, every theory developed since 1915 has had to be consistent with Einstein's insights. The GPS satellites that make smartphone navigation possible work only because their clocks are corrected for relativistic time dilation, running slightly faster in their orbits than clocks on Earth's surface, exactly as Einstein's equations predict. Particle accelerators that probe the structure of matter must account for relativistic mass increase, particles becoming harder to accelerate as they approach the speed of light. General relativity predicted phenomena that seem like science fiction. Black holes, regions where space-time curvature becomes so extreme that not even light can escape. The expanding universe, space itself stretching over cosmic distances. Gravitational waves, ripples in space-time travelling at the speed of light. All of these predictions, initially met with skepticism, have been confirmed by observations. Black holes were detected first, indirectly through their effects on nearby stars, then directly when the Event Horizon Telescope captured the first image of a black hole's shadow in 2019. The expansion of the universe was discovered by Edwin Hubble in 1929, measuring the redshift of distant galaxies. Gravitational waves were finally detected in 2015, exactly 100 years after Einstein published General Relativity, when the LIGO Observatory measured the ripples in space-time created by 2 colliding black holes a billion light-years away. Einstein's equation ERMC2 changed human civilization. It explained the power source of stars, nuclear fusion converting hydrogen to helium and releasing the energy that makes the sun shine. It made possible nuclear power, providing a significant fraction of the world's electricity. It made possible nuclear weapons, casting a shadow over human future that Einstein himself recognized and deplored. The photoelectric effect, which won Einstein the Nobel Prize, became the foundation for photovoltaic solar cells, converting sunlight directly into electricity. Modern electronics, semiconductors, lasers, all depend on quantum mechanics, the theory whose development Einstein sparked even as he later rejected its interpretation. Beyond the specific technical applications, Einstein changed how we think about the universe. Before Einstein, space and time were assumed to be absolute, fixed, unchanging backdrop against which events occurred. After Einstein, space-time became dynamic, participating in physical processes, bending and stretching in response to matter and energy. This shift in understanding was philosophical as well as scientific. It suggested that the universe was stranger, more subtle, more interconnected than anyone had imagined. It validated the power of abstract mathematical reasoning to reveal hidden truths about nature. It showed that common sense and everyday intuition could be wrong about the deeper structure of reality. Einstein became the public face of science in the 20th century, the embodiment of genius and abstract thought. His image appeared everywhere. His name became synonymous with intelligence. His ideas penetrated popular culture even though very few people understood them technically. This was partly due to his work, which was genuinely revolutionary, but also due to his personal qualities, the combination of intellectual brilliance and human warmth, the refusal to take himself too seriously, the willingness to engage with the public. He showed that a scientist could be a moral voice, could speak out on issues beyond science. His opposition to nuclear weapons, his advocacy for civil rights, his support for Zionism, his criticism of McCarthyism, all established a model of the scientist as public intellectual, using the credibility gained through scientific achievement to influence broader social and political questions. Yet Einstein's personal life reveals the costs of genius and the complexity of the man behind the myth. His treatment of his first wife Mileva was often cold and calculating. His abandonment of his daughter Liesel remains troubling. His emotional distance from his sons, particularly from Edward, whose schizophrenia he could not cope with, shows limitations in his capacity for intimacy and emotional engagement. He was not a saint, not a perfect humanitarian despite his advocacy for peace and justice. He was a flawed human being whose gift happened to be an extraordinary capacity for abstract thought, for seeing mathematical patterns in physical phenomena, for holding competing ideas in mind until he could find the deeper principle that reconciled them. Modern assessments suggest Einstein may have been on the autism spectrum, his intense focus and difficulty with social interaction fitting patterns recognized today. This is speculative diagnosis across time, but it offers a framework for understanding his contradictions, how someone could be so empathetic in the abstract, advocating for humanity and peace, while being emotionally unavailable in personal relationships. In physics, Einstein's later isolation from the mainstream remains instructive. His refusal to accept quantum mechanics as a complete theory, his pursuit of unified field theory using classical methods, his rejection of the probabilistic interpretation of reality, all proved futile. Quantum mechanics has been confirmed by countless experiments. The unified field theory Einstein sought has not been found using his methods, though modern string theory and other approaches pursue similar goals using quantum frameworks Einstein never accepted. Yet even in his failures, Einstein demonstrated something valuable. He showed the importance of following one's own intuition, of pursuing questions that matter to you even when others consider them futile. He refused to accept answers that felt incomplete, that violated his sense of how reality should work. This stubbornness led nowhere in his later work, but it had driven his earlier breakthroughs. The same quality that made him question Newton and Maxwell made him question Bohr and Heisenberg. The debates between Einstein and Bohr about quantum mechanics, recorded in letters and recollections, remain philosophically fascinating, even though most physicists consider Bohr to have won on scientific grounds. Einstein's famous assertion that God does not play dice, Bohr's reply that Einstein should stop telling God what to do. These exchanges go beyond technical physics to questions about the nature of reality, the role of observation, the meaning of probability. Einstein's hope was always for a deeper theory, one that would preserve the objective reality he believed in, while explaining quantum phenomena as emerging from some underlying deterministic structure. This hope has not been fulfilled, and most physicists doubt it will be. But the search continues, and even if Einstein's specific approach was wrong, his insistence that we should not be satisfied with mysteries might still drive future breakthroughs. The institutions Einstein helped establish continue his legacy. The Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he spent his final decades, remains a paradise for theoretical research, supporting mathematicians and physicists to pursue fundamental questions without teaching duties or pressure to produce practical applications. The model Einstein embodied, of pure research driven by curiosity, has been copied at institutes around the world. The Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which Einstein helped found, and to which he left his papers and the rights to his image, preserves his legacy in the Jewish community he supported despite his own irreligious outlook. The university's Albert Einstein archives contain over 80,000 documents, letters, manuscripts, photographs, a record of one of the most consequential lives of the modern age. More broadly, Einstein's example showed that science transcends national boundaries, that truth is universal, that cooperation across borders and cultures is not just possible but necessary. His own life, moving from Germany to Switzerland to Germany to the United States, refusing nationality that conflicted with his values, standing apart from nationalistic fervour, embodied this internationalism. In an era when science faces new challenges, when expertise is questioned, when nationalism and tribalism resurge, Einstein's example reminds us of science's power to unite, to find common ground in shared observation and mathematical reasoning. His willingness to change his views when evidence demanded it, to accept that he was wrong about quantum mechanics even while maintaining his philosophical objections, shows the scientific attitude at its best. The photograph taken at his 72nd birthday party in 1951 captures something essential. Einstein, asked by the photographer to smile, stuck out his tongue in a playful gesture of rebellion. The image became iconic, the serious genius showing mischievous humour, refusing to take himself too seriously, maintaining to the end a quality of playfulness and wonder. That playfulness was central to his genius. He thought in images and experiments, imagining riding a beam of light, visualizing trains and clocks, picturing falling elevators. He played with ideas the way children play with toys, following his curiosity wherever it led, delighting in surprising conclusions. Science was not work to Einstein, but play, the best kind of play, where you discover real truths about how things work. The man himself is gone now for nearly 70 years. The wild white hair, the rumpled sweater, the violin under his chin, the boat on the lake, the study filled with papers all vanished into memory and photograph. The house on Mercer Street stands, preserved but empty of his presence. The chalkboard at Princeton, where he scrawled his last equations, has been erased and written over countless times. But the ideas persist. Every physics student learns special relativity, working through the Lorentz transformations, deriving time dilation and length contraction, understanding how simultaneity is relative. Every physics student learns general relativity, studying the field equations, calculating simple metrics, understanding how mass curves space-time. Every physics student knows EAMC2, knows the photoelectric effect, knows that Einstein changed everything. The universe Einstein revealed, four-dimensional space-time curved by matter and energy, where time slows near massive objects and space stretches between galaxies, where light has both wave and particle nature, where mass and energy are equivalent, where nothing can travel faster than light. This is the universe we live in, the universe that satellite navigation and GPS confirms every time we use our phones, the universe that particle accelerators and astronomical observations verify again and again. 3 centuries from now, will Einstein's theories still be taught? Almost certainly yes. They're too accurate, too fundamental, too deeply woven into the structure of physics to be discarded. They may be supplemented by deeper theories, perhaps the quantum gravity theory Einstein never found. They may be special cases of more general principles, the way Newton's gravity is a special case of Einstein's. But they will remain useful and true within their domain, the way Newton's laws remain useful and true for everyday speeds and scales. The man who made these discoveries was neither saint nor monster, but something more interesting, a human being with extraordinary gifts and ordinary failings, driven by curiosity and stubbornness, capable of seeing what others could not see but blind to much that was in front of him, warm in friendships and cold in intimacies, playful in thought and rigid in certain convictions. He spent 76 years on Earth, and in that time he saw further than anyone before, him into the nature of space and time and gravity and light. He changed how we see the universe and ourselves. He made discoveries that will matter as long as humans do science. That would be enough for any legacy, more than most could hope for. But he also showed us something about the life of the mind, about the joy of understanding, about the value of following questions wherever they lead. In his own words, written late in life, the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Einstein never lost that sense of mystery, never stopped feeling wonder at the strangeness of existence. He questioned everything, trusted his intuition, followed his curiosity, refused to accept conventional wisdom when it conflicted with his sense of how things should be. Sometimes this led him astray, as in his rejection of quantum mechanics. Sometimes it led to insights that changed human understanding forever. On a spring night in Princeton, if you walk past the house on Mercer Street, you might imagine an elderly man in a rumpled sweater sitting in his study, violin resting on the desk beside him, pages of equations spread across the workspace, thinking about gravity and geometry, about light and time, about the unified theory he would never find, still searching, still questioning, still wondering about the mysteries of the universe until the last breath left his body and he became part of those mysteries himself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Albert Einstein. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Einstein's life resonated most with you, and where in the world you are as you listen to these words, and what time it is in your corner of our shared world. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you rest, wonder, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding something new. May you never lose your sense of mystery, your curiosity about how things work, your willingness to question what you think you know. The universe is stranger and more beautiful than we imagine, and there are always more mysteries waiting to be understood. Good night.